The third day of the Ohio heatwave was the kind of day that makes you question the life choices that led you to a landlocked state. The air wasn't just hot, it was thick. You could feel the humidity clinging to your skin like a wet wool blanket. It was air you had to chew before you could breathe. The sun beat down on the suburban paradise of Maple Creek with a kind of personal animosity, turning the manicured lawns a sad shade of beige and making the asphalt on the roads go soft and sticky. Inside my workshop, however, it was a crisp 68 degrees. The hum of my oversized window AC unit was the only soundtrack I needed. I was engaged in a task of monumental importance: reorganizing my collection of industrial-grade zip ties. Some people meditate. I categorize plastic fasteners by length, color, and tensile strength. It's calming. My name is Jack, and this is what I do when I'm not running my small but mighty event rental and general handyman business. You need a bouncy castle and a repaired gutter in the same weekend? I'm your guy. My phone buzzed on the workbench, rattling against a stray socket wrench. The caller ID read Mrs. Gable. I smiled. Mrs. Gable was the unofficial activities director over at the Sunny Vistas Senior Living Center, the tidy brick building that shared a property line with my workshop. She was 93 years of sass and knitting needles. Jack's House of Miracles and Minor Electrical Repairs, I answered. Her voice, usually a cheerful warble, was thin and strained. Jack, honey, it's Carol from the HOA. She cut the power to our generator. The world screeched to a halt. My perfectly sorted pile of 8-inch, 50-pound test zip ties suddenly seemed incredibly frivolous. Carol. Of course, it was Carol. Carol was the president of the Maple Creek Homeowners Association, a position she wielded with the gravitas of a Supreme Court justice and the empathy of a parking meter. She was a human-shaped vortex of joyless compliance. A woman whose only apparent pleasure in life came from finding things that were 1/8 of an inch out of regulation. The generator I'd loaned the senior center yesterday, a quiet little Honda unit, was currently the only thing keeping their common room's AC running. The main power grid in our neighborhood had been flickering on and off for 2 days, too stressed to cope. For the residents of Sunny Vistas, air conditioning wasn't a luxury, it was a critical piece of medical equipment. Especially for Millie, my adopted grandmother and the sharpest gin-rummy player in the state, who relied on an oxygen machine and couldn't handle extreme heat. She just walked over and flipped the main breaker on it? I asked, my voice dangerously calm. She did, Mrs. Gable confirmed, her voice trembling. Said it was an unapproved temporary structure and a noise violation. She took a picture of it with her phone, Jack. A picture! I closed my eyes and pictured Carol's smug, pinched face as she documented her victory over a life-saving appliance. The rage came on hot and fast. But rage doesn't fix things. Action does. All right, Mrs. Gable, don't you worry. Go back inside, tell everyone to stay calm. I'll have a new one running in less than 5 minutes. Oh, thank you, dear. I knew you would. I hung up. I didn't yell. I didn't punch anything. I walked to the massive roll-up door at the back of my workshop, the one that faced the alley between my property and Sunny Vistas. And there, under a dusty tarp, sat my pride and joy, my nuclear option. Her name was Big Bertha. She was a trailer-mounted 40-kilowatt diesel generator I'd bought at a municipal surplus auction 2 years ago for a ridiculously low price. She was painted a faded safety yellow and was approximately the size of a smart car. This wasn't a machine designed for quiet, suburban comfort. This was a relic from an era when problems were solved with displacement and diesel, a generator designed to power a MASH unit or a small town after a hurricane. Starting it wasn't a matter of pulling a cord. It was a sequence of buttons and switches that ended with a deafening, earth-shaking roar. I hitched Bertha to my pickup, my movements precise and economical. I grabbed the heavy-gauge cables, each as thick as my arm, and threw them in the truck bed. I hit the starter sequence. The engine coughed out a plume of black smoke, sputtered for a second, and then erupted into a glorious, window-rattling crescendo of an internal combustion. The concrete floor beneath my feet vibrated. I glanced at my watch. 3 minutes and 20 seconds since I'd hung up with Mrs. Gable. I backed the roaring behemoth out of my workshop and down the short driveway to the senior center. The residents were clustered near the main entrance, fanning their faces with magazines, their expressions a mixture of fear and hope. As I pulled up, the oppressive silence left by the little Honda generator was obliterated. Big Bertha didn't hum. She bellowed. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated power. I hopped out of the truck, grabbed the cables, and jogged to the building's transfer switch. 4 minutes, 10 seconds. I was getting slow in my old age. As I slammed the heavy-duty plugs into place, I heard it. The unmistakable click-clack of sensible shoes on pavement, approaching with righteous indignation. The boss music had started. Carol had arrived. She materialized from behind a perfectly pruned boxwood hedge, as if summoned by the decibel level. Carol was in her full uniform, a pastel pink polo shirt tucked neatly into khaki capris, pristine white sneakers, and a visor that shielded her eyes but did nothing to soften the permanent scowl etched onto her face. In her left hand she held her weapon of choice, a clipboard. Trailing a few paces behind her was her husband, Gary, a man whose entire existence seemed to be a silent plea for a quiet life of grilling and watching golf. He looked at Big Bertha with the terrified awe of a caveman seeing fire for the first time. "Excuse me!" Carol shouted over the din, her voice a reedy instrument struggling against an orchestra of pistons. "What is the meaning of this?" I finished connecting the last cable and straightened up, wiping a sheen of sweat from my forehead. I gave her my most pleasant customer service smile. "Just a little routine power restoration, Carol. Didn't want your constituents to turn into human puddles. Figured that'd be against some bylaw or another." She marched closer, her eyes scanning the generator trailer. "That thing," she said, pointing a trembling finger at Big Bertha, "is in clear violation of HOA Noise Ordinance 17B, which limits continuous noise to 60 decibels at the property line. Furthermore, it is an unregistered vehicle parked on a non-paved surface, a violation of Section 9F, and its aesthetic is not in keeping with the community's pre-approved visual standards, as outlined in Appendix C, Paragraph 2. Her husband, Gary, nodded vaguely, as if he'd heard this speech 1,000 times. I leaned against the trailer, feigning deep thought. "Wow, you've got all the numbers. That's impressive. Tell me, Carol, which bylaw covers a situation where an HOA president willfully cuts power to a building full of vulnerable senior citizens during a record-breaking heat wave? I'm just curious where reckless endangerment falls in the HOA hierarchy. Is that above or below unapproved garden flamingos?" Carol's face went from pink to a dangerous shade of crimson. "I was enforcing the rules that you agreed to when you moved here, Mr. Peterson. That illegal generator you had here before was a nuisance." "It was quieter than your riding lawnmower, Carol, and it was keeping Millie's oxygen machine running. But please, tell me more about the rules." Just then, the gentle whir of the senior center's industrial-sized air conditioner kicked on. A collective sigh of relief, followed by a smattering of applause, drifted from the open doorway. Millie herself appeared, giving me a grateful wave. Carol saw this, and it only seemed to fuel her righteous fury. "I have already notified the authorities of this blatant disregard for our community covenants." On cue, a police cruiser pulled up to the curb. Out stepped 2 officers. The first was Sergeant Davis, a man who looked like he'd been 2 weeks from retirement for the last 10 years. His face was a roadmap of exhaustion, and he moved with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who had seen every possible flavor of suburban absurdity. The second was Officer Miller, a rookie with a haircut so fresh you could still smell the aftershave. He had that bright-eyed, by-the-book look that hadn't yet been crushed by years of dealing with people like Carol. "Folks," Sergeant Davis said, his voice a gravelly baritone of pure weariness, "getting a little loud over here. What's the problem?" "Officer, thank goodness," Carol exclaimed, stepping forward to intercept them. "This man, Jack Peterson, is operating unauthorized industrial machinery in a residential zone. It's a clear violation, not to mention a public nuisance." Davis's eyes drifted from Carol's frantic gesturing to Big Bertha's thundering engine, then to the smiling faces in the doorway of the senior center, and finally to me. I just gave him a little shrug. "Sergeant," I said calmly, "the power grid's been unreliable. The AC in the senior center is essential. Their backup generator, a small one, was disabled by this woman here." I pointed at Carol. "This is the only other unit I have that can power their whole building. It's a temporary medical necessity." Officer Miller dutifully took out his notepad. "Did you disable their generator, ma'am?" he asked Carol. "I enforced a covenant," she snapped. "It was unapproved." Davis let out a long, slow sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the entire county's 911 calls. He walked over to the generator, squinting at it. He looked back at Carol. "So, let me get this straight. You want me to shut this thing off, Blum? Forcing all these people back into a 100-degree building because it's too loud?" "It's the principle of the matter," Carol insisted. "The rules are what separate us from anarchy." Sergeant Davis looked at the seniors, then at the generator, then at Carol's clipboard. I could see the mental calculus happening in his head, weighing a noise complaint against a dozen potential cases of heat stroke. "Look," he said finally, turning to me, "this thing can't stay here forever. It sounds like a 747 is trying to land on the lawn. You need to find a permanent and quieter solution. A compliant solution." He said the last word while looking directly at Carol, who puffed up with vindication. "I will be monitoring this situation," she declared, making a sharp, decisive note on her clipboard. "And daily fines will be assessed for every day this monstrosity remains." "Understood, Sergeant," I said, ignoring her completely. "I'll get right on it." Davis nodded, looking relieved to have found a path that involved the least amount of paperwork. He and Miller got back in their cruiser and drove off. Carol gave me one last triumphant smirk before turning on her heel and marching back toward her beige and gray fortress of conformity, Gary trailing in her wake like a sad, khaki-colored shadow. I watched her go, a slow smile spreading across my face. She thought she'd won. She thought she'd backed me into a corner with her rules and her clipboard. What she didn't realize was that she hadn't just started a fight with me. She had declared war, and she'd just handed me the rule book I was going to use to beat her. I walked into the blessed coolness of the Sunny Vistas common room. The air, which had been thick and stagnant just minutes before, was now circulating with the life-giving chill of Freon. The residents were buzzing, the near crisis having injected a shot of adrenaline into their afternoon. Mrs. Gable rushed over to give me a hug that smelled faintly of lavender and toast. "Oh, Jack, you're our knight in shining armor." "More like a guy in a grease-stained t-shirt with an unnecessarily large generator," I chuckled. "But I'm glad it's working." I saw Millie sitting in her favorite armchair by the window, her portable oxygen tank humming quietly beside her. The color was back in her cheeks. She beckoned me over. "You really rattled her cage, kiddo," she said, her eyes twinkling. "She started it," I said, pulling up a chair. "Telling me I'm breaking the rules when she's the one putting you all in danger. It just gets under my skin." "She lives for those rules," Millie said, shaking her head. "I think it's all she has." I looked around the room. I saw Mr. Henderson, a retired history professor, deeply engrossed in a book. I saw two ladies who must have been sisters, bickering good-naturedly over a game of Scrabble. These were good people. They'd worked their whole lives, raised families, paid their taxes. Now they just wanted to live out their days in peace and comfort, not at the mercy of a petty tyrant with a clipboard. That was it. The anger that had been simmering inside me cooled and solidified into something hard and clear. Resolve. This wasn't about a generator anymore. This was about drawing a line in the sand. Carol wanted a war fought with her weapons: rules, regulations, and bureaucracy. Fine. I'd become a master of the bureaucratic arts. I would learn her sacred texts, the HOA bylaws, and I would use them to build something so perfectly, so unimpeachably compliant, that it would make her head spin. I went home not to my workshop, but to my office. I pulled out the thick binder of HOA documents I'd received when I bought my house, the one I'd immediately thrown in a drawer labeled junk. I blew the dust off it and opened it. The Maple Creek Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions read with all the thrilling prose of a dishwasher manual. But tonight, it was the most fascinating book in the world. I grabbed a whiteboard from my workshop, dragged it into the living room, and uncapped a black marker. At the top, in big, bold letters, I wrote, "Project Thermonuclear Compliance." This was going to be my masterpiece. I began to outline the phases, my mind racing with possibilities, a giddy sense of righteous purpose bubbling up inside me. Phase 1, Intelligence Gathering. Get digital copies of everything: HOA bylaws, city noise ordinances, county building codes, zoning maps, aesthetic guidelines. Highlight every rule, every restriction, every single comma. Identify the contradictions and loopholes. Bureaucracies always have them. They're like software bugs in the system of human misery. Phase 2, Assemble the vanguard. I can't do this alone. I need a contractor. Not just any contractor. I need one who has been personally victimized by an HOA. Someone who sees a clipboard and feels a primal rage. Someone who understands that this isn't a construction job. It's a moral crusade. Phase 3, the paperwork tsunami. We will submit applications for everything: the concrete pad, the electrical trench, the generator enclosure, the color of the paint on the enclosure, the brand of screws used to hold the paint to the enclosure. Every form will be filled out in triplicate, perfectly, with all supporting documentation attached in a binder thick enough to stop a bullet. We will drown Carol and her Architectural Review Committee in a sea of meticulously organized paper. Phase 4, Flawless Execution. The construction will adhere to every single rule. We will start work at the exact minute allowed by the noise ordinance and stop on the dot. Our worksite will be cleaner than Carol's kitchen. Every interaction will be polite, professional, and infuriatingly cheerful. We will kill her with kindness and compliance. Phase 5, Victory. Install a permanent, quiet, powerful generator that will serve the senior center for decades. Ensure it is so profoundly, aggressively, and undeniably up to code that Carol can do nothing but stand there, clipboard limp in her hand, and watch her authority crumble into dust. I stood back and looked at my whiteboard. It was beautiful. It was devious. It was the most exciting thing I had planned in years. I cracked my knuckles and picked up my phone. I knew exactly who to call. There are contractors who advertise on slick radio commercials and have shiny new trucks. And then there's Gus. Gus is the guy you call when your problem can't be solved with a simple quote. He's semi-retired, meaning he only takes on jobs that are either absurdly easy or personally interesting. His defining feature is a deep, philosophical hatred for petty bureaucracy, cultivated over 40 years of dealing with city inspectors, zoning boards, and his natural enemy, the Homeowners Association. I found his number in my contacts under Gus Knows Things. He answered on the third ring with a weary grunt. If this is about a deck, the answer is no. Gus, it's Jack Peterson, and it's not about a deck, it's about justice. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear his eyebrow arching. Go on. I laid out the whole story. The heat wave, the seniors, the disabled Honda generator, Big Bertha, and Carol. I made sure to describe the clipboard, the bylaw numbers she rattled off, the smug look on her face when the cops showed up. I didn't just offer him a job, I offered him a front-row seat to the downfall of a petty tyrant. Gus, I finished, my voice low and serious. She quoted bylaws while Millie was struggling to breathe. She wants a war of paperwork. I want to give her the psalm. Another long pause. I could hear the faint sound of him stroking his magnificent gray beard. A sound-dampened enclosure you'd need, he mused, already thinking in technical specs. Dedicated concrete pad, 4-inch thick minimum with rebar. Trench for the conduit has to be at least 18 inches deep. You'd need permits for all of it. I know, I said. That's the point. I'll bring my excavator, he said finally, a hint of glee in his voice. And Kevin? We agreed to meet at Greasy's Diner the next morning to plan our campaign. I arrived to find Gus already in a booth, nursing a black coffee, and studying a copy of the HOA bylaws I'd emailed him. He'd printed them out and was already making notes in the margins with a carpenter's pencil. He was a mountain of a man, with hands that looked like they could crush bricks and a flannel shirt that had seen more action than most soldiers. A moment later, his crew arrived. Kevin was a giant, silent man who moved with surprising grace. He nodded at me, sat down, and immediately ordered 3 pancakes. He was, I would learn, the muscle and the best excavator operator in the state. Dave, the electrician, was the opposite. A wiry, caffeinated ball of nervous energy who looked like he'd just seen a ghost. He ordered a coffee with 6 shots of espresso and immediately started talking about the National Electrical Code and the surprising conductivity of squirrels. All right, Gus said, slapping the binder of bylaws on the table. I've read the enemy's playbook. It's garbage, but it's the garbage we have to work with. For the next hour, we huddled in that booth, mapping out our strategy. It was a beautiful thing to behold. Gus saw loopholes where I just saw bad grammar. Right here, he said, tapping a page. Article 6, Section D. All permanent external structures must be constructed of materials harmonious with the existing dwelling. But it doesn't define harmonious. That's our wiggle room. We can argue that a nice, professionally finished beige enclosure is more harmonious than her rusty bird bath. Dave, vibrating slightly, pointed to another page. And the electrical code addendum she put in is a joke. She's referencing the 1998 code. It's been updated 4 times since then. We'll follow the 2023 code, which gives us way more options for conduit placement. She can't say a word about it. Kevin, between mouthfuls of pancake, simply grunted and gave a thumbs up. We hammered out the plan. We'd install a top-of-the-line natural gas standby generator. It would be quiet, efficient, and permanent. We would encase it in a custom-built, soundproofed enclosure that looked like a tidy little shed. We'd paint it the exact shade of greige, as Carol's own house. The malicious poetry of it was just too good to pass up. The final piece was the budget. I'd talked to the Sunny Vistas board. They could pitch in a few $1,000s from their emergency fund, but it wouldn't be enough to cover the kind of high-quality, over-engineered job I had in mind. Don't worry about it, I told Gus. I'll cover the rest. Consider it a community improvement project, or a psychological warfare fund, whichever you prefer. Gus looked at me, and a slow, genuine smile spread across his face. "I like you, kid," he said. "You're my kind of crazy." We left the diner with a full set of plans, a clear strategy, and a shared sense of holy purpose. The A-team of B-list contractors was officially assembled. Project Thermonuclear Compliance was a go. The first shot in the paperwork war was fired the following Tuesday. I, guided by Gus's 40 years of bureaucratic combat experience, drafted the official application for the Sunny Vistas Auxiliary Power Unit and Aesthetic Utility Enclosure. It was a masterpiece, 84 pages long, spiral-bound, with a table of contents. It included 3D-rendered architectural drawings of the enclosure from 6 different angles, a list of materials complete with manufacturer spec sheets, a preliminary noise abatement study, and a copy of the proposed work schedule. It was cross-referenced with every relevant HOA bylaw and city code we could find. I hand-delivered it to Carol's front door and placed it gently on her welcome mat, as if it were a sacred offering. The rejection came via email less than 3 hours later. Subject: application denied. Mr. Peterson, your application has been reviewed and denied by the Architectural Review Committee. The proposed structure is not in keeping with the harmonious aesthetic of the Maple Creek community. Please refer to Bylaw 6D. Sincerely, Carol Ann Miller, President, HOA. No explanation, no specifics. Just a condescending, one-sentence shutdown. It was exactly what we expected. "She's lazy," Gus grunted over the phone. "She thinks that'll be the end of it. She doesn't know who she's dealing with. Time for Phase 2. Our response was swift. I drafted a formal request for clarification on official letterhead. Dear Miss Miller and the Architectural Review Committee, thank you for your prompt review. To ensure our revised application meets the community's standards, could you please provide specific, actionable feedback regarding the non-harmonious elements? Furthermore, to aid in our selection of a more appropriate aesthetic, we have attached a palette of 12 pre-approved HOA siding colors from the official MCHOA guidebook. We kindly request the committee vote on their preferred option and inform us of the result, so we may incorporate it into our revised design. I attached high-resolution images of 12 nearly identical shades of beige and taupe. Her reply was clipped and furious. She clearly didn't want to engage, but my formal request, which I had CC'd to the HOA secretary, forced her hand. She ignored the color palette and invented a new roadblock. Mr. Peterson, before any aesthetic considerations can be made, the committee requires a full geological survey of the proposed site to ensure the concrete foundation will not disrupt subterranean drainage or local insect habitats. A certified report is required for reconsideration. A geological survey for a 5 by 7 foot concrete pad. It was absurd. It was brilliant. It was meant to stop us dead with an expensive, time-consuming hurdle. Insect habitats? Gus roared with laughter when I told him. She's worried about the ants? Okay, kid, I know a guy. The guy was Gus's nephew, a college geology student named Tim. For $100 and a case of beer, Tim spent an afternoon on the senior center's lawn. He poked the ground with a metal rod, took some soil samples in Ziploc bags, and used a lot of official-looking terminology. The result was a 40-page preliminary geotechnical and entomological site analysis that was 90% fluff and graphs he'd downloaded from the internet. It concluded with utmost seriousness that the proposed construction would have negligible impact on the resident Formicide population and would not, in fact, cause a seismic event. We submitted it the next day. Carol was now officially enraged. Her next move was to call an emergency HOA meeting. The topic? A proposed addendum to Bylaw 17B regarding the permissible hours and decibel levels of residential construction equipment. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a sterile room with folding chairs and fluorescent lighting. I arrived with Millie on one arm and Mr. Henderson on the other, a small but determined entourage of seniors. Carol stood at a podium at the front, looking severe. She launched into a speech about peace, tranquility, and the sanctity of weekend mornings. She proposed a new rule that would limit construction noise to between 9 a.m. and 4 p.m. on weekdays only, and cap the decibel level so low that only hand tools could be used. When she finished, she asked for questions. I raised my hand politely. Jack Peterson, 124 Oak Street. Carol, I just want to thank you for your dedication to the community's well-being. It's admirable. I smiled sweetly. She narrowed her eyes, suspicious. I just have a quick procedural question. According to Article 12, Section 2 of the HOA's own governing documents, any change to the bylaws requires a 30-day written notice to all homeowners before a vote can be held. This meeting was announced 3 days ago via email. So, while this has been a fascinating discussion, we can't actually vote on this tonight, can we? A murmur went through the crowd of about 20 homeowners. The HOA secretary, a flustered-looking woman named Brenda, started flipping frantically through her binder. She found the page, read it, and her face fell. He's right, Carol, Brenda stammered. We can't vote tonight. The air went out of Carol's sails. She had been publicly outmaneuvered with her own rule book. Several other homeowners started complaining about having their evening wasted. The motion was tabled. I had won the battle. As we left, Carol shot me a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. The paperwork war was heating up, but for now, the project was still alive. We had permission to move forward to the next, most dreaded stage of any project, City Hall. We were high on our victory, but Gus, ever the grizzled realist, brought us back to earth. Don't get cocky, kid, he warned as we drove to the city municipal building a few days later. Winning a battle against an amateur like Carol is one thing. You're about to face the professionals. The Maple Creek Permitting and Zoning Office was a beige-colored room that seemed to suck the very will to live out of you the moment you stepped inside. The air was stale with the smell of old paper and quiet desperation. Behind a plexiglass barrier sat a woman with a helmet of hair that hadn't changed since 1982, and a nameplate that read Dolores. Dolores was the gatekeeper. She was the final boss of bureaucracy. We waited in line for 20 minutes before it was our turn. I slid our pristine, binder-clipped application packet through the small opening in the plexiglass. I explained the project calmly and clearly. A permanent standby generator for the Sunny Vistas Senior Living Center. A crucial piece of safety equipment. Dolores looked at our application without touching it. She stared at it as if it had personally offended her. Then, she looked up at us over the top of her bifocals. Senior Center, she said, her voice flat. Is that a commercial property or a multifamily residential property? Multifamily residential, I believe, I said. And your property is zoned R2 residential single family, she stated, not as a question, but as an indictment. You can't install commercial-grade equipment in an R2 zone without a variance, and you can't install a permanent auxiliary power unit for a multifamily dwelling without a commercial permit. Gus stepped forward. It's a natural gas generator, Dolores. It's quieter than the HVAC unit on your roof. It's for safety. Dolores was unmoved. The code is the code, she intoned, as if reciting a sacred text. To get a commercial permit in an R2 zone, you'll need to apply for a zoning variance. That requires a public notice to be posted for 30 days, followed by a public hearing in front of the Planning Commission. If they approve the variance, which they probably won't, then you can submit your commercial application. That requires a site plan review, an environmental impact statement, and a traffic impact study. A traffic impact study? I asked, my voice cracking slightly. It's a generator. It sits there. The only traffic it's going to generate is a maintenance guy once a year. The code is the code, Dolores repeated, her eyes cold and dead. The whole process, if you're lucky, takes about 90 days, maybe 120. Next? We were dismissed. We stood on the steps of City Hall, stunned into silence. Gus kicked at a loose piece of gravel. "I hate this town," he muttered. It was an insurmountable wall. A 90-day review period, public hearings, a traffic study for a stationery box. Carol hadn't beaten us. A faceless, nameless system had. All her ridiculous HOA nonsense was nothing compared to the soul-crushing efficiency of true government bureaucracy. Carol must have heard about our failure through the grapevine. That evening, a smug email landed in the inbox of every single Maple Creek homeowner. Subject, Community Project Update. Dear neighbors, an update regarding the unapproved industrial project at the Sunny Vistas facility. After a review by the city, it has been determined that the project is in violation of numerous zoning ordinances and cannot proceed. The HOA is committed to ensuring all projects adhere to the proper legal channels and maintain the peaceful residential character of our neighborhood. Thank you. Sincerely, Carol Ann Miller. It was a victory lap in email form. I had to break the news to the seniors that evening. I explained the situation, the permits, the delays. They were, to their credit, incredibly gracious. They told me I'd done more than enough and thanked me for trying. But I could see the deep disappointment in their eyes. Millie patted my hand. "You did your best, dear. That's all anyone can ask." And somehow, that felt infinitely worse than if she'd been angry. I walked home across the lawn, the triumphant roar of Big Bertha, who was still faithfully powering the center, sounding more like a funeral dirge. I looked at my whiteboard, at the bold heading, Project Thermonuclear Compliance, and felt a wave of defeat wash over me. The war was over, and we had lost. I spent the next 2 days in a funk. I avoided my workshop, letting Big Bertha's diesel fuel run low as a symbol of my dwindling hope. I was packing up the binder of plans and permits, ready to consign it to the drawer of failed projects, when there was a soft knock at my office door. It was Mr. Henderson, the quiet history professor from Sunny Vistas. He was holding a glass of what looked like iced tea, but smelled suspiciously like whiskey. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said in his soft, academic voice. "Mildred told me you were taking the news rather hard." "I just hate losing, Mr. Henderson. Especially to them," I grumbled, gesturing vaguely toward Carol's house. "I understand," he said, taking a slow sip. He looked at the binder on my desk. "She mentioned something about a traffic impact study?" A small, wry smile played on his lips. "For a stationary object? How delightfully absurd. I used to be a lawyer, you know, before I took up the far more sensible profession of studying the fall of the Roman Empire. City planning law, to be specific. Mind if I take a look at the city code they cited?" I was too dejected to argue. I handed him the thick printout of the Maple Creek Municipal Code. He sat down in my client chair, put on a pair of reading glasses, and began to read. For an hour, the only sound was the rustle of turning pages and the quiet clinking of ice in his glass. I mostly just sulked and stared out the window. Finally, he looked up. "Fascinating," he murmured. "Utterly fascinating. This is a mess of contradictions, a patchwork of panicked legislation from a dozen different eras." He stood up. "May I borrow this overnight, Jack? I have a theory I'd like to investigate." I shrugged. "Knock yourself out." The next morning, my phone rang at 7 a.m. It was Mr. Henderson. His voice, usually so calm and measured, was electric with excitement. "Jack, I've found it. It's beautiful. It's perfect. City Ordinance 344B. Meet me at City Hall in an hour, and bring your application." When I met him on the steps of the municipal building, he was holding a thin, leather-bound book and practically vibrating with intellectual glee. "This," he said, tapping the book, "is the official record of city ordinances from 1955. I got the city clerk to pull it from the archives. We walked back into the belly of the beast, and fatefully got Dolores again. She looked at us with an expression of profound boredom. Back again? The Planning Commission doesn't meet for another 6 weeks. Good morning, Dolores, Mr. Henderson said cheerfully. We are here to file this permit application under the provisions of City Ordinance 344B. I slid the application back under the glass. Dolores didn't even look at it. Never heard of it. I'm not surprised, Mr. Henderson said, opening the old leather-bound book. It was passed in 1955, during the height of the Cold War. It's titled the Civil Defense Auxiliary Infrastructure Act. It was designed to encourage the outfitting of public buildings as civilian fallout shelters. He slid the open book under the glass, his finger pointing to a specific paragraph. As you can see right here, he continued, his voice taking on a professorial tone. The ordinance states that any designated civil defense shelter is pre-authorized for the installation and maintenance of essential auxiliary power and ventilation systems. And furthermore, such installations are expressly exempt from all standard zoning reviews and permit period requirements to ensure civil readiness. Dolores read the paragraph. Her eyebrow twitched. This building isn't a fallout shelter. Ah, but it is, Mr. Henderson said, pulling another document from his briefcase. It was a copy of the building's original blueprints from 1958. He pointed to a symbol on the basement plan, a circle with 3 triangles inside. That is the official federal symbol for a public fallout shelter. The Sunny Vistas Senior Living Center, formerly the Maple Creek Community Home, was built with a reinforced concrete basement to serve this very purpose. The designation has never been rescinded. Therefore, under the city's own laws, we are not only allowed to install this generator, we are encouraged to— Dolores stared at the documents. She read the ordinance again. She looked at the blueprint. A slow, grinding sound seemed to emanate from the bureaucratic gears in her head as they were forced to turn in an unexpected direction. She was trapped. Without a word, she picked up the phone and made a call. We could hear muffled, urgent whispering. She hung up. She picked up a heavy, old-fashioned rubber stamp, inked it on a purple pad, and with a resounding thump stamped our application. The word approved in big block letters shone like a beacon of hope. She slid the papers back to us. Your permit is approved, she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Have a nice day. We walked out into the sunlight, victorious. Mr. Henderson was beaming. The beautiful thing about bureaucracy, Jack, he said, patting my shoulder, is that it has a very long memory, but very poor eyesight. You just need to know where to look. I had my loophole. The war wasn't over. It had just begun. I called Gus with the news. There was a moment of stunned silence on the phone, followed by a roar of triumphant laughter that probably registered on a seismograph somewhere. A fallout shelter, he boomed. Oh, that's beautiful, kid. That's poetry. We start tomorrow morning. Sharp. The next day at precisely 7:01 a.m., 1 minute after the city noise ordinance legally permitted construction to begin, the symphony of construction began. Gus, Kevin, and Dave descended on the peaceful cul-de-sac of Maple Creek like a well-organized biker gang on a mission from God. First came Kevin with his excavator. The machine was surprisingly small, but Kevin handled it with the delicate precision of a surgeon. He began to dig the trench for the electrical and gas lines, peeling back the manicured lawn with surgical neatness. The excavated dirt, however, had to go somewhere. And Kevin, with a subtle nod from Gus, began piling it in a neat, geometrically perfect mountain right on the property line, directly in the line of sight of Carol's kitchen window. Next, the concrete truck arrived. The driver, a friend of Gus's we'd briefed on the situation, seemed to have a faulty backup alarm. It wasn't just beep, beep, beep. It was an ear-splitting, variable-pitch shriek that echoed through the morning calm. He had to make three-point turns repeatedly, each one a symphony of beeping and engine revving. "Sorry!" he'd yell out the window with a grin. "Safety first!" Carol's front door opened. She stood on her porch in a silk bathrobe, her hair in a net, her face a perfect mask of apoplectic rage. She saw the mountain of dirt, the beeping truck, the general beehive of activity, and her mouth opened and closed like a fish. She was speechless. Dave, the electrician, began his work. He needed to cut some metal conduit, a task he performed with a high-pitched angle grinder that sang the song of its people, which happened to sound like 1,000 angry dentists. He seemed to find an endless supply of things that needed cutting, always pausing when Carol looked away and starting up again the moment her gaze returned. We were a model of efficiency and compliance. Our worksite was cordoned off with safety tape. Everyone wore a hard hat. We had a copy of our stamped permit laminated and displayed prominently on a small easel. When Carol finally stormed over, clipboard in hand, to demand what was going on, Gus just smiled warmly. "Morning, ma'am. Beautiful day for some community improvement, isn't it?" he said, handing her a copy of the permit. "Everything is city approved. We're just trying to get this done for the nice folks here as quickly and safely as possible." She snatched the paper, her eyes scanning for a flaw, a loophole, anything, but there was none. She stared at the big purple approved stamp, at the reference to Ordinance 344B. Defeated, she could only sputter, It's 7 in the morning." "Yes, sir, ma'am, it is," Gus beamed. "Up and at 'em, the early bird gets the worm." The climax was the delivery of the generator itself. It arrived on a massive flatbed truck with a crane. To position it correctly, the crane's outriggers had to extend out, temporarily blocking the end of Carol's driveway. We had the permit for that, too, a temporary obstruction of residential access permit that I'd had expedited for an extra $50. For 2 glorious hours, she was a prisoner in her own home, forced to watch as the pristine, beige-colored generator was gently lowered onto its freshly cured concrete pad, a monument to her spectacular failure. Through it all, the seniors of Sunny Vistas watched from their windows and the porch, sipping coffee and cheering us on. It was better than television. It was the most exciting thing to happen in Maple Creek in years. By the end of the second day, the work was complete. The trenches were filled, the sod replaced so neatly you could barely tell it had been disturbed. The generator sat in its handsome, custom-built enclosure, painted a lovely shade of Carol's House Greige. It was connected to the gas line and the building's electrical system. All that was left was the final inspection. I called the city, and they agreed to send an inspector out that very afternoon. A man named Frank, with a friendly face and a no-nonsense attitude, arrived right on time. He had our plans on a tablet and began his methodical check. He checked the gas line pressure, the wiring connections, the clearance around the unit. Gus and I stood by, answering his questions. "Looks like a clean install," Frank said, nodding with approval. "Very professional." And that's when Carol made her last stand. She came marching across the lawn, not with a clipboard this time, but with her phone pressed to her ear. And right behind her, their lights off but their presence undeniable, was the police cruiser containing Sergeant Davis and Officer Miller. "Inspector!" Carol cried, her voice strained with desperation. "Stop! You cannot approve this. This is an illegal commercial installation in a residential zone. They have violated a dozen codes. I have a police escort to prove it." Frank the inspector looked from Carol to the police car and back to the generator, his expression one of mild confusion. Sergeant Davis got out of the car, looking even more tired than he had the first time we'd met. "Ma'am, I have the approved plans right here, signed off by the city," Frank said calmly, holding up his tablet. Everything matches. The installation is up to code." "But it's illegal!" Carol shrieked. "The zoning!" This was the moment, the culmination of all our work. I stepped forward, holding up the laminated copy of our permit. "Actually, Carol, it's perfectly legal. Under the 1955 Civil Defense Auxiliary Infrastructure Act, also known as City Ordinance 344B. As this building is a designated fallout shelter, we're exempt from the standard zoning review. I'm sure Dolores at the permit office would be happy to explain it to you." The name Dolores seemed to land with an audible thud. Carol's face went blank with confusion. Fallout shelter? Ordinance 344B? It was a language she didn't understand. She had built her entire world on the modern bylaws, and we had defeated her with a ghost from the past. Frank the inspector, satisfied, turned to me. "Looks good. Fired it up yet?" I grinned. I walked over to the control panel, flipped the cover, and pressed the test button. There was a soft click, and then the generator hummed to life. But it wasn't the roar of Big Bertha. It was a gentle, powerful thrum, a sound quieter than the central air conditioner on Carol's own house. It was the sound of quiet, efficient, and deeply satisfying victory. Carol stood there, sputtering, her last-ditch effort crumbling around her. She turned to Sergeant Davis, her eyes pleading. "Officer, you have to do something." Sergeant Davis walked over, his face grim. "Carol," he said, his voice low but firm. "We've had 3 separate calls from you about this property today. None of them involved an actual crime. This project is legally permitted and approved. This is officially becoming a misuse of police resources." He pointed a stern finger at her. "As of this moment, if you call 911 for an HOA-related issue that isn't a life-threatening emergency, you will be cited. Do you understand me?" It was the final, devastating blow. Her ultimate weapon, calling the authorities, had been turned against her. Her power, her authority, her entire reason for being had evaporated on a sunny Ohio afternoon. She stared at Davis, then at me, then at the quietly humming beige box. For the first time since I'd met her, she had nothing to say. She turned, a look of utter defeat on her face, and walked back to her house, not with the march of a president, but with the slow, shuffling gait of a deposed queen. The war was over. We had won. That evening, the lawn of Sunny Vistas was transformed. The residents had strung up fairy lights and set up folding tables. Someone had brought out a portable speaker playing Frank Sinatra. They were throwing a generator warming party. Gus, Kevin, and Dave were the guests of honor, sitting at a picnic table while residents lavished them with praise and plates of food. Kevin looked overwhelmed but happy. Dave was explaining electrical theory to a captivated audience of 3 grandmothers, and Gus was holding court like a returning war hero. Mrs. Gable presented me with the pièce de résistance, a sheet cake decorated with gray frosting to look like the new generator, complete with a little red candle for the warning light. "To our hero," she announced, and the small crowd gave a cheerful round of applause. I cut the cake, feeling a little embarrassed, but mostly just deeply satisfied. Later, I took a slice and a can of cold soda and went to sit with Millie on her favorite bench. We watched the party, a gentle breeze finally breaking the back of the heat wave. "You know," Millie said, after a comfortable silence, "it's not really about the generator, is it?" I looked over at the quiet, beige box that had been the epicenter of our little suburban war. It sat there, unassuming and ready, a silent guardian. Then I looked at the happy, laughing faces of the residents, safe and secure. I glanced across the street at Carol's house, where all the lights were off, even though it was getting dark. "Nope," I said, taking a bite of the surprisingly delicious generator cake. "It's about the principle. And maybe, I added with a grin, a little bit about the noise. We sat for a while longer, just enjoying the quiet victory. The new generator was so silent you could barely hear it running. It would kick on automatically whenever the power failed, protecting the residents without any fuss or drama. It was the perfect solution, a compliant solution. I took one last look at the pristine beige enclosure, a monument to malicious compliance. It was perfect in its adherence to the rules, a testament to the fact that sometimes the best way to fight a broken system is to follow its rules more perfectly than your opponent ever could. It looked good, but as I sat there, a final, snarky thought drifted through my mind. I wonder if the bylaws say anything about decorative flame decals.